Section 1. The Secret That Cannot Be Spoken. Somewhere out in the dark between the stars, a war is being fought that you are never supposed to know about. Not a war of armies clashing on some distant front where the soil turns red and the sky fills with smoke, and the names of the fallen get carved into stone for someone to read a century from now. Not the kind of war that gets remembered. Not the kind that earns a name in the history scrolls that scholars will argue over in warm archive rooms thousands of years later. This is a different kind of war entirely. It is fought in silence. It is fought in shadow. And the men who fight it are, by every official account of the Imperium of mankind, ghosts. They do not exist. Their names appear in no founding registry, on no chapter roll, in no catalogued record that any ordinary citizen of the Imperium would ever be permitted to read. If you somehow stumbled across a reference to them, if you somehow found yourself standing on a battlefield where they had just been, if you happened to see the flash of silver armor moving through the smoke and the fire, and you survived long enough to wonder what you had just witnessed, well, someone would take care of that. They would make sure you stopped wondering very quickly, in one way or another. But they are real. They are as real as anything in this galaxy, as solid as ceramite plate, as cold and certain as the void between the worlds. Their fortress home sits on a moon of Saturn, right there in the Sol system, not far from Terra itself, carved out of black basalt and wrapped in psychic wards so dense that the very space around it bends and shimmers. They have been fighting since before the living memory of almost anyone alive today. They have faced things that would dissolve the sanity of a normal human being in seconds flat, things that tear through reality like wet paper and speak in voices that rearrange your mind as you listen. And they have never once, in over 10,000 years of continuous warfare against those things, lost a single soul to the corruption that claims almost everything that gets too close to the darkness they fight. They are the Grey Knights. And the only reason you might be sitting here, listening to this, watching light from your screen play across the walls while the rest of the world quiets down around you, is because they have been doing their job perfectly for a very long time. There is something uniquely haunting about this chapter of Space Marines, and it goes beyond the obvious surface-level mystique of silver armor and forbidden knowledge and secret wars. Most Space Marine chapters carry their identity like a banner. They want you to know who they are. The Blood Angels paint their armor the red of old grief and carry the memory of their fallen Primarch in their very blood, in the literal genetic code that shapes their bodies and colors their dreams. The Space Wolves howl their presence across battlefields with the kind of joy that only the truly dangerous can afford to feel. The Ultramarines bear the weight of being the standard against which all others are measured, and they have carried that weight without bending for 10 millennia. These are chapters that are known, chapters that are felt, chapters whose names have moved through the mythology of the Imperium until they have become something more than simple military organizations. They are stories. They are symbols. The Grey Knights are something else entirely. They are a chapter built around absence, around the deliberately cultivated illusion that they do not exist at all. Their victories go unrecorded in any history that anyone outside a very small and very carefully selected circle of people will ever read. The worlds they save from the absolute worst things the galaxy can produce, the incursions they halt, the rifts they seal, the ancient demonic entities they send, screaming back into the formless dark of the warp, none of it gets written down where anyone might find it. If you want to find their history, you have to go looking in places that most people will never be allowed to go, past wards and locks, and the kind of security measures that tend to leave very permanent marks on the people who try to bypass them. And yet, somehow, the legend of the Grey Knights filters through, not through records, not through official channels, through something closer to instinct, something that seeps through the collective unconscious of a species that has been fighting the dark for 10,000 years and knows, on some level below rational thought, that there are things standing between them and the absolute worst the universe has to offer. Things wearing silver armor, things that burn like a clean light in the face of everything corrupt and ruinous. Things that are, in some sense, the last answer, the final argument. The one card in the deck that gets played only when every other option has been exhausted, and the alternative is annihilation of a kind that makes ordinary death look appealing. Let us sit with that for a moment. Let the weight of it settle. Because before we can talk about what the Grey Knights are, before we can trace the strange and terrible and genuinely remarkable path that led to their creation, we need to really understand what they were made to fight. We need to understand why a secret army of psychic warrior monks was considered not just a good idea, but an absolute necessity. We need to understand what it is that hides in the formless dimension of psychic energy that underlies all of physical reality, the place the people of the 41st millennium call the warp, and what happens when those things decide to step through. Because daemons are not just monsters. They are not simply large, aggressive organisms with biology shaped by evolution toward violence. Every galaxy has those. The Imperium deals with those routinely, with varying degrees of success and casualties. Daemons are something categorically different. They are emotions given form. They are the concentrated psychic residue of conscious experience, given shape and will and appetite by the roiling, impossible energies of a dimension that exists completely outside of the logic of the material universe. When a daemon takes form in real space, it does not arrive the way any other creature arrives. It punches through the membrane between dimensions like a fist through paper, and everything around the point of arrival is immediately, pervasively wrong in ways that language was not designed to describe. Geometry stops working properly. Time becomes unreliable. People who are nearby stop being reliably themselves, because the psychic pressure of a demonic incursion reaches into the mind and finds the things that are already wrong there, the fears and the hungers and the long-held secret grievances, and amplifies them past the point where a person can hold them in check. This is what the Imperium has been fighting for 10,000 years in secret, behind the curtain, that the Ordo Malleus and the Grey Knights maintain, with blood and will, and an absolute refusal to let ordinary human beings fully understand what is coming for them on a daily basis. The theory, such as it is, being that if the population of 1 trillion worlds fully grasped the nature of what exists on the other side of reality, the sheer collective terror would only make things worse. The warp is shaped by consciousness. Despair feeds the entities within it. So you hide the worst of it. You fight the battles that cannot be acknowledged. And you make very sure that the people who do that fighting are incorruptible in a way that goes beyond ordinary courage or faith, or even the extraordinary resilience of a standard space marine. This is what the Grey Knights are. This is what they were built to be. And the story of how they came to exist is almost as strange and remarkable as the story of what they are capable of. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is, whether it is the middle of the day or the small hours of the night when everything gets quiet enough for something like this. And if you have not already subscribed, take a moment to do that now. It helps more than you might think, and there is a great deal more of this kind of story ahead. Section 2. The Emperor's Darkest Foresight. To understand why the Grey Knights were created, you have to understand something about the Emperor of mankind that does not sit comfortably alongside the golden divine figure that most citizens of the Imperium spend their lives praying to. The Emperor was not simply powerful. He was not merely the most gifted warrior, or the most brilliant strategist, or the most formidable psyker the species had ever produced, though he was all of those things so comprehensively that the second and third most impressive examples of those qualities might as well have been ordinary men standing next to him. Beyond all of that, beyond the raw power and the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of living that preceded even the founding of the Imperium, the Emperor possessed the ability to see forward along the branching paths of time in a way that even the most gifted human precognitives could barely approximate. He looked forward, he looked at what was coming, and he saw clearly that the Horus Heresy was not simply a civil war, not simply one catastrophic betrayal among the many catastrophes that mark the history of any sufficiently ambitious civilization. It was the opening of a wound in the fabric of reality that would never fully close. The powers of the warp, the entities that exist there and feed on human consciousness and emotion, specifically the four great powers that the people of the 41st millennium have given names to: Khorne the Blood God, Tzeentch the Changer of Ways, Nurgle the Plague Father, and Slaanesh the Prince of Pleasure. These entities had a stake in what was happening to the Imperium. They had invested in Horus. They had worked through the Primarchs who fell, through the legions that turned, through 1,000 years of subtle corruption that preceded the open violence of the heresy itself. The war was not just a human conflict with supernatural elements. It was, in a very real sense, the opening move in a game that was always going to continue regardless of who won the battles on the surface. The Emperor understood this. He understood that even if the forces of chaos were beaten back, even if Horus was stopped, even if the traitor legions were scattered and broken and driven beyond the edge of the galaxy, the entities themselves, the actual demonic powers, and their legions of warp-born servants, could not be defeated in any permanent sense. They could be denied. They could be driven back. They could be held at bay by psychic defenses and the sincere faith of a population large enough and spiritually resilient enough to generate a kind of collective immunity. But they could not be destroyed in the way that a physical army can be destroyed. You cannot kill a concept. You cannot put an idea permanently to death. Khorne is the embodiment of war and slaughter. As long as there is war in the universe, Khorne exists. As long as there is conscious life capable of change and manipulation and scheming ambition, Tzeentch exists. The warp powers are not going anywhere. They are permanent features of the reality that underlies material existence. So, the question was not how to eliminate the threat of demonic incursion. The question was how to manage it. How to maintain a fighting force capable of responding to demonic incursions across a galaxy-spanning empire, without every soldier who fought in those battles becoming either a source of psychic pollution through their experiences of the demonic, or a liability through simple knowledge of what they had seen. Because the first principle of the Ordo Malleus, the organization that would eventually come to encompass and command the Grey Knights, is that knowledge of the demonic is itself a kind of contagion. Ordinary people who see daemons and survive the experience do not simply walk away with a bad memory and a tendency to flinch at loud noises. They carry something back with them, something that can spread, something that can draw the warp's attention back to them, and through them, to everyone around them. The Emperor saw all of this in the dying days of the heresy, when it must have been very clear that the final confrontation was coming and that the cost of it was going to be everything. He was already making plans for a future he would not be fully present for, a future in which he would be sitting on a golden throne, doing the work of a psychic lighthouse, rather than walking the galaxy as an active, present, physical force. He was preparing for an existence as a kind of immortal ghost, pinned to the material world by the need to keep the Astronomicon burning and to ward the corridors of the webway against the endless pressure of the warp. He was making arrangements for the governance of the Imperium in his absence, for the establishment of the institutions that would keep humanity from collapsing in on itself. And among all of those arrangements, alongside the High Lords of Terra and the Primarchs he trusted, and the endless bureaucratic apparatus of a civilization that spanned millions of worlds, he found time to consider the specific problem of daemon incursion. His solution was characteristically absolute. If ordinary soldiers could not fight demons without being contaminated by the experience, then what was needed was soldiers who were entirely immune to contamination by their very nature. If the knowledge of the demonic was dangerous in ordinary minds, then what was needed were minds that could hold that knowledge without being reshaped by it. If the warp's power was the tool that demons wielded against anything that tried to oppose them, then what was needed were warriors who could wield that same power, could reach into that same dimension of psychic energy and draw it through themselves as a weapon without being consumed by the process. Warriors who were, at their core, simply and completely and irrevocably incorruptible. The idea of building such a thing from scratch, of engineering through gene seed and training and selective recruitment, a body of warriors who would be incapable of the kind of corruption that had taken even Primarchs, even beings literally shaped by the Emperor's own hand and will, was a project of extraordinary ambition. Every gene seed implanted in Space Marines since the very beginning of the Astartes project had been drawn from a Primarch. The biological legacy of those semi-divine beings was what gave Space Marine chapters their identities, their physical characteristics, their particular strengths, and the particular flaws that lurked beneath those strengths. And those Primarchs had, several of them, fallen. Their genetic material carried the trace of that vulnerability, not as a certainty, not as an automatic sentence, but as a possibility that careful selection and rigorous training and relentless spiritual conditioning tried to minimize rather than eliminate. For the Grey Knights, the Emperor chose differently. Their gene seed would not come from a Primarch, it would come from himself. From the actual genetic material of the most powerful human being who had ever lived, the being who had walked the earth for tens of thousands of years, gathering strength and wisdom against exactly this kind of moment. The implications of this choice are staggering when you sit with them. It means the Grey Knights are, in a biological sense, closer to the Emperor than any other Space Marines. It means that when they call themselves Sons of the Emperor, they mean it in a way that other chapters, for all the genuine devotion behind the phrase, cannot quite match. Their gene seed carries the imprint of a mind and body that had spent uncountable millennia in contact with the warp without being consumed by it, that had engaged with the deepest levels of psychic power while remaining, at its core, something that refused absolutely and completely to be anything other than what it had chosen to be. That refusal, that fundamental bedrock incorruptibility, is what the Emperor was trying to encode into the very biology of his new chapter. Whether it worked entirely because of the gene seed, or because of the gene seed combined with everything else, the training and the rituals and the careful selection of candidates who showed the right qualities even before any modification was applied, is a question that the scholars of the Inquisition have argued over for millennia without reaching consensus. What is not in question is the result. In over 10,000 years of fighting, the most corruption-intensive warfare imaginable, not one Grey Knight has ever fallen. Not one has betrayed the Emperor. Not one has been turned by the powers they oppose. In a galaxy where corruption is not just possible but practically inevitable for anyone who gets close enough to the daemonic for long enough, that record is either the most extraordinary achievement in the history of the Adeptus Astartes, or it is the most powerful evidence that the Emperor's original design was exactly as sound as he intended it to be. Probably both, honestly. Section 3. Malcador, the Sigillite, and the Gathering of Champions. The Emperor could not do this himself. Not directly, not actively, not in the way that he had directed the creation of the original 20 Space Marine legions. Not with the kind of hands-on, present, physically engaged superintendents that the early Astartes project had benefited from. Because the Horus Heresy was happening, the galaxy was tearing itself apart. The siege of Terra was on the horizon, and every moment of the Emperor's attention that was not focused on the survival of the planet that housed the seat of his empire was a moment that the forces arrayed against him could potentially exploit. So he delegated, and the man he delegated to was, by any reasonable assessment, the second most important human being alive at that particular moment in history, Malcador the Sigillite, First Lord of Terra. The Emperor's right hand, his counselor, his trusted agent in all the truly critical decisions of the age. A man who was himself a psyker of extraordinary power, who had served the Emperor long enough that the two of them had developed the kind of working understanding that does not need to be articulated in detail, because it has been tested through enough shared history that its solidity is simply assumed. Malcador knew what the Emperor needed. Malcador knew why. And Malcador was brilliant enough and capable enough to go out and actually find what was required. The brief was specific. He needed warriors, not just soldiers, not just psychers, not just brave or capable men, though they would need to be all of those things. He needed warriors of absolute moral character, of unimpeachable psychological resilience, of genuine and total incorruptibility that was not simply a matter of not having been tested hard enough yet. He needed people who had already been tested hard enough, who had already faced the worst the galaxy could show them, and come through the other side of it, not just intact, but somehow more themselves, more defined in what they were and what they would not become, rather than less. He needed people who had stared into the absolute deepest darkness and found, looking back at them from within it, not the reflection of their own worst impulses amplified and made irresistible, but simply nothing. A flat refusal, a wall that would not move. He found 12 of them. This number 12 is interesting in itself, because Malcador did not find 12 Space Marines, or 12 purely military figures whose entire context was combat. He found 12 men from different backgrounds, different functions, different corners of the Imperium's vast and complicated war effort. 4 of the 12 were not warriors in the direct physical sense at all. They were lords and administrators, men whose gift was for the organization and direction of large and complex endeavors, rather than for personal combat. These 4 would become the foundation of something else, something the Imperium would come to know as the Inquisition, the great secret police and intelligence service that would eventually encompass the Ordo Malleus itself. The other 8 were Space Marines. And not just Space Marines from the loyal legions. Some of them, in one of the most striking and quietly profound details of this entire origin story, had come from legions that had turned traitor. They themselves had remained loyal, had refused the corruption that claimed their brothers, and their primarchs, had in some cases been among the very first to raise the alarm about what was happening within the legions. But their organizational homes were gone, swept away in the catastrophe of the heresy, and they were men between contexts, loyal warriors without a legion, searching for purpose amid the greatest catastrophe their civilization had ever faced. The process of finding these 8 Space Marines was entrusted significantly to Nathaniel Garrow, himself one of the most interesting figures in the history of the Horus heresy, a former Death Guard officer who had escaped the corruption of his legion aboard a ship called the Eisenstein and carried warning of Horus's betrayal to Terra ahead of the full extent of the calamity. Garrow became something of a talent scout for Malcador, seeking out among the survivors and refugees of the shattered loyalist elements of turned legions, those individuals who had shown not just physical resistance, but something deeper, something in the way they handled the knowledge of what their brothers had become, something in the way they processed that loss, and found, on the other side of it, not bitterness or despair or the kind of desperate rage that makes a man dangerous to everyone around him, but clarity, purpose, a clean, focused, very specific kind of anger that could be aimed. Among those who joined the cause were figures who already had considerable histories of their own. Tylos Rubio, a librarian of the Ultramarines, a psyker of real power who had operated against the prohibition on psychic use within the legions when necessity demanded it. Macer Varen, former captain in the World Eaters who had refused Angron's madness, a man who carried within him the extraordinary contradiction of a warrior shaped by a legion devoted to mindless slaughter, who had nevertheless maintained a core of genuine tactical intelligence and personal honor. Garviel Loken, perhaps the most tragic figure in all of Horus's inner circle, the man who had been the War Master's equerry and had watched, closer than almost anyone, the process of his lord's corruption, and who had survived that experience and the nightmarish events of Istvan III to come back as something that refused absolutely to be broken. These were the kinds of men Malcador was assembling, the ones who had been through things that should have destroyed them and had come out the other side of it still recognizably themselves. They became known as the Knights Errant, a small group of exceptional individuals working directly for Malcador in the frantic, terrible period when the heresy was at its height and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. And from among the Knights Errant, Malcador ultimately selected the 8 Space Marines who would become the founding Grand Masters of the Grey Knights. Their original names, their identities before Titan, were deliberately obscured. What history has recorded are their names within the New Order, names taken from the old mythologies of ancient Terra, from the stories of the Titans of Greek legend. They were called Janus, Epimetheus, Chiron, Koios, Ogen, Iapto, and others whose names similarly echo with the weight of those ancient stories. 8 men, carrying the accumulated experience and the careful selection of everything that Malcador and Garrow could find in the dying days of the greatest war humanity had ever fought. The 8 were taken to Titan. Malcador opened a portal through the webway and led them to the fortress already being prepared on Saturn's largest moon, a place carved from black stone and already being reinforced with psychic wards and the kind of long-term structural investments that only make sense if you are planning for something that is going to last a very long time. He explained to them what they were to become. He explained the gene seed. He explained the training that would follow, the recruits that would eventually be brought to them, the specific and absolute nature of the war they had been chosen to dedicate whatever remained of their lives to. He explained that their names would be forgotten, that the battles they fought would go unrecorded in any history that anyone outside their circle would ever read, that the sacrifice they were being asked to make was not just of their physical safety, but of the ordinary human desire to be remembered, to have their existence acknowledged, to have their deeds mean something in the eyes of the civilization they were protecting. Janus became the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. The choice made sense. He was among the most capable of the 8, most suited for the leadership of an institution that was going to have to be simultaneously a military force, a monastic order, a center of arcane scholarship, and a secret so total that even its location could not be made generally known. The 8 men set about the work of becoming the chapter that would stand against the worst the galaxy could produce. And then Malcador did something that was either an act of extraordinary foresight or an act of desperation. And in the context of the Siege of Terra, it was probably both simultaneously. He hid Titan in the warp. Section 4. Titan, the moon that vanished into the warp. This is one of the genuinely extraordinary moments in the history of the Grey Knights, and it does not get talked about enough, probably because the scale of it is difficult to properly absorb if you try to take it in all at once. Titan is the largest moon of Saturn. In the real, physical universe of the 41st millennium, it is a significant body, massive enough to have a dense atmosphere, and to serve as the home of the largest and most important fortress monastery in the Imperium's arsenal of daemon-fighting tools. It is a moon of Saturn, which means it is in the Sol system, which means it is right there, practically next door to Terra in astronomical terms. And in the final days of the Horus Heresy, as the traitor legions were closing on Terra itself, and the siege was beginning, and everything that the Imperium had built over 2 centuries of the Great Crusade was in very real danger of burning, Malcador the Sigillite wrapped the entire moon in a psychic bubble of reality and pushed it into the warp. Let that settle for a moment. This was not a small act of concealment. This was not hiding a building behind a cloaking field, or obscuring a single installation behind psychic wards that made detection difficult. This was taking a physical object roughly 5,000 kilometers in diameter and relocating it entirely and completely into a different dimension of existence. The engineering involved, if you can call the application of psychic power on that scale engineering, was something that virtually no other individual in the history of humanity could have accomplished. It required a depth and breadth of psychic ability that placed Malcador firmly in a category occupied by very few beings, even in a universe as crowded with powerful psychers as the 41st millennium. He did it for a reason that was simultaneously completely logical and utterly grim. The Siege of Terra was the most dangerous psychic event in human history up to that point. The sheer concentration of violence and death and demonic influence at the seat of the Imperium was generating warp resonance on a scale that was warping local reality. The entities within the warp were paying very close attention to what was happening on Terra. In that environment, a group of recently founded space marines in a fortress on a nearby moon who were specifically dedicated to fighting those entities would have represented an extremely tempting target. The warp powers are not stupid. They are, in many ways, more strategically sophisticated than any mortal opponent, because they have the advantage of perspective that comes from existing partially outside the normal flow of time. If any of the 4 great powers had been able to identify the nascent Grey Knights and act against them before they were properly established, the chapter's entire purpose would have been undermined before it was even begun. Titan in the warp was invisible to that kind of attention. You cannot strike at something you cannot perceive, and the warp is vast in ways that make even the galaxy look modest. A single moon tucked away in the formless immensity of that dimension, wrapped in psychic wards maintained by the considerable will of Malcador himself, was genuinely safe in a way that Titan, in normal space, adjacent to the psychic catastrophe of the siege, simply was not. There is something deeply lonely about the image that creates. 8 space marines, who had each already lost everything that had defined them, their legions, their brothers, the context in which their identities had been formed, now sitting on a moon in a dimension that is, by definition, not part of the universe, unable to communicate with Terra, unable to affect the outcome of the battle that was deciding the fate of everything they had sacrificed to protect. They could only wait, train, prepare, process, in whatever way each of them was capable of processing it, the fact that the war they had given everything for was being decided somewhere they could not reach. Meanwhile, back in real space, time was moving. The Siege of Terra was fought. Horus was defeated, at the cost of everything the Emperor had left to spend. The traitor legions were scattered. The Chaos Powers, denied their victory, pulled back their most direct investments, though they never truly withdrew. The Primarchs who survived began the work of picking up the pieces. And Titan sat in the warp, waiting, the Grey Knights inside, continuing their preparation for a role that the rest of the galaxy did not yet know they had been designed to fill. When Titan returned to normal space, the experience of time that the chapter had lived through did not match the experience of time in the rest of the universe. This is a characteristic quirk of the warp, which does not share the linear, sequential relationship with time that material reality maintains. Inside Titan's bubble, a certain amount of time had passed. Outside, considerably more had passed. The exact figures vary in different sources, but the practical result was that when the Grey Knights emerged from their long isolation in the warp, they found themselves in a galaxy that had moved on significantly from the one that had been hidden away when Malkador sent the moon to safety. The galaxy they came back to was one in which the Emperor was already enthroned, in which the Codex Astartes was being written, in which the great reorganization of the Space Marine legions into chapters was already underway. The Grey Knights arrived into this changed galaxy, with Malkador's psychic shielding finally dissolved, not by any external force, but by the death of Malkador himself, who had, in the end, burned the last of his extraordinary life in service to the Emperor at the moment of the siege's conclusion. His final act was to take the place of a man on the Golden Throne, to sit in that impossible seat and channel the psychic energies required to maintain it so that the Emperor could engage directly with Horus, knowing that the price of this service was his life. He returned from that act as nothing more than a hollow shape of ash that crumbled when touched. And when he died, the psychic ward around Titan dissolved, and the chapter he had helped to found itself back in the world, in a galaxy that needed them desperately, and that would, for the most part, I never know they were there. Janus and the other founding Grand Masters immediately set about the work they had been preparing for. The citadel of Titan began to grow. The first recruits were sought. The libraries of forbidden knowledge began to be assembled, and the Grey Knights began the slow, careful, immensely expensive, in every sense of the word process of becoming the institution they were always meant to be. In the current era of the 41st and 42nd millennia, Titan remains the seat of that institution. It sits in the outer Sol system, in orbit around Saturn, surrounded by several other moons that the Inquisition has appropriated for various purposes. Mimas serves as a prison and execution facility for the Ordo Malleus. Enceladus houses some of the leadership of the Ordo and a number of particularly influential inquisitors. The space around Titan is not crowded in the way that the space around Terra is crowded, not thick with the traffic of 10,000 years of accumulated civilization. It is quiet, deliberately so. The rings of Saturn provide a certain amount of natural cover. The psychic wards that Malkador originally placed on Titan, and that have been maintained and extended by the chapter's librarians and the tech priests of their allied Forge world, ever since, provide considerably more. To sensors, Titan reads as largely empty. To psychic perception, it reads as something that simply does not want to be looked at directly, something that slides away from focused attention like a word on the tip of your tongue that keeps not quite arriving. This is as intended. The Grey Knights have been hiding in plain sight for 10,000 years. They are very good at it by now. There is a detail about the 8 founding Grand Masters that deserves specific attention, because it illuminates something important about the nature of the institution they created. Malkador named them the Titans. The reference was deliberate, reaching back to the mythologies of ancient pre-imperial Terra, to the stories of the Titans of Greek legend, the primordial beings who came before the Olympian gods and who were defined by their enormous power and by their eventual confinement, each bound in some way to a specific role or fate. Prometheus, chained to his rock. Atlas bearing the weight of the heavens. Cronus imprisoned after his defeat. The Titans of myth were not diminished figures, they were immense. But they were also, at the end of their stories, constrained by the things they had chosen to serve or to oppose, shaped by their conflicts into configurations that left no room for anything except the specific function they had come to embody. There is something in this naming that suggests Malkador understood clearly what he was asking of the 8 men he was appointing. He was not creating soldiers who would serve for a time and then retire to whatever passed for peace in a post-heresy galaxy. He was creating something closer to permanent fixtures. Beings who, like the mythological titans they were named for, would find their entire existence subsumed into the enormous and specific function they had accepted. The Grey Knights, as an institution, reflect this founding quality. They do not do anything except what they were made to do. They do not have the equivalent of garrison chapters that produce Astartes, who spend peacetime administering worlds or developing diplomatic relationships or engaging in the broader life of the Imperium. Everything the chapter does and is, every resource it maintains, every warrior it trains, every piece of equipment it produces on Deimos, is oriented entirely toward the single specific purpose of demonic containment and destruction. This extreme focus is one of the things that makes the Grey Knights so effective. It is also one of the things that makes them, in certain lights, slightly unsettling even to those who are fully aware of the valuable work they do. An organization that has spent 10,000 years doing exactly one thing, in exactly one way, optimizing every aspect of its existence toward exactly one goal, develops a quality of single-mindedness that can look from the outside like the absence of something rather than the presence of something. Other Space Marine chapters have cultures. They have songs and rituals and internal disagreements and histories of internal conflict and moments of self-doubt and individual warriors who resist expected norms and find their own paths through what it means to serve. The Grey Knights have these things too, in attenuated form. But the weight of the chapter's purpose presses on all of them with a consistency that tends to flatten the ordinary variance of human experience into something more uniform. And yet, they are not machines. This is the paradox that the chapter embodies so completely that it becomes something like a philosophical puzzle if you sit with it long enough. They are the most thoroughly conditioned, most rigidly purposed, most systematically shaped warriors in the Imperium. And they are also, demonstrably, people, real ones, capable of the kinds of relationships and commitments and specific individual character that make a being irreducible to its function. Garen Crow is not merely the sword-bearer. Arvan Stern is not merely the unlucky captain whose misfortune-shaped career produces tactically interesting situations. Kaldor Drygo in the Warp is not merely the supreme Grand Master executing his programming. They are, despite everything done in the making of them, themselves. And the fact that the process produces people, rather than simply very effective weapons, is probably the deepest argument for the chapter's ultimate correctness in its approach to its mission. Section 5. Becoming a Grey Knight. The 666 Rituals of Detestation. Most Space Marine chapters are selective. All of them are, by necessity. The process of transforming a human being into an Astartes is complex and dangerous enough that even without any additional filtering at the selection stage, a significant proportion of candidates simply do not survive the transformation. The biological changes involved, the implantation of the 19 gene seed organs that reshape the human body into something capable of the performance levels expected of a Space Marine, are substantial enough that bodies which are not precisely right for the process simply fail to accommodate them. And that is, before you account for the psychological and spiritual demands of the training that follows, which in most chapters is itself rigorous enough to eliminate a meaningful proportion of the candidates who make it through the biological transformation. The Grey Knights are not most Space Marine chapters. The selection process for the Grey Knights begins not on a recruiting world, not with scouts testing the potential of young warriors in whatever environment the chapter draws its candidates from, but on the black ships. These are the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organization tasked with identifying and collecting untithed psychers from across the Imperium and transporting them to Terra for processing by the Adeptus Astronomica. The black ships are, if you think about what they actually contain, among the more unsettling conveyances in the Imperium's service. They carry people who are fundamentally dangerous to themselves and to everyone around them. Individuals who have developed the ability to perceive and interact with the warp without having been trained to do so safely, which means they are, to varying degrees, leaking psychic energy in ways that attract exactly the kinds of attention you do not want to attract. The black ships are very well warded. The people on them are very carefully monitored. The overall atmosphere is apparently not something you would describe as pleasant. This is where the Grey Knights go shopping, so to speak. The Gatherers are the specific arm of the chapter tasked with seeking out potential recruits, and they look for candidates among the psychers being transported on the black ships, among untithed psychers on worlds beyond the reach of the normal Imperial collection apparatus, and sometimes, in cases that other chapters would find deeply objectionable if they knew about it, among the candidate pools that other Space Marine chapters are in the process of developing for themselves. The gatherers are not above simply taking aspirants who were destined for other chapters if those aspirants show the particular combination of qualities that the Grey Knights are looking for. They do not usually ask permission. What are those qualities? Psychic potential is the baseline. Every single Grey Knight is a psyker. Every one. This is unique among Space Marine chapters. A standard chapter has librarians, a specialized role for warriors with psychic gifts who receive additional training to control and deploy those gifts safely. In a standard chapter, librarians are relatively rare, the psychers among a much larger body of non-psychic warriors. In the Grey Knights, every member of the chapter is a librarian in the sense of having psychic ability, though they organize and rank that ability differently according to the specific gifts and power levels involved. Finding warriors who are not just physically capable but also psychically gifted in the relevant ways is therefore an enormously complicated logistical undertaking, which is part of why the chapter is and has always been small compared to a standard Codex Astartes chapter, generally maintaining around 1,000 battle brothers rather than the roughly 1,000 that a standard chapter targets, but rarely achieves by means that require the specific biological compatibility that Grey Knight recruitment demands. But psychic potential is only the start. The gatherers are also looking for something harder to quantify, something in the moral and psychological architecture of a candidate that suggests the specific kind of resilience that Grey Knight service demands. They are looking for people who have, ideally, already been tested in some meaningful way. People who have encountered something genuinely terrible and found, on the other side of that encounter, that they are still recognizably themselves. The fear response has not consumed them. The exposure to darkness has not reshaped them toward it. They have processed whatever happened and retained, underneath the processing, a core that is simply and thoroughly incorruptible. If a candidate survives selection and is brought to Titan, what follows is described in the lore as something that would break even the greatest of normal Space Marines. The 666 Rituals of Detestation. That number is not incidental. In the symbology of the 41st millennium, the number 666 carries a specific weight. The Grey Knights are, technically, the 666th chapter of Space Marines. Their most feared enemies are the daemons of chaos, entities that are defined by their relationship to numbers and symbols in ways that normal physical creatures are not. Using that number for the process by which new Grey Knights are forged is a deliberate act of reclamation, of taking the number most associated with the dark and making it the number of trials that must be passed to stand against that dark. It is the kind of gesture that says something important about the culture of the chapter, the willingness to engage with the symbols and tools of what they fight, rather than flinching away from them. What exactly the 666 Rituals of Detestation involve is not comprehensively documented, partly because the Grey Knights are meticulous about keeping such information away from unauthorized access, and partly because many of the rituals are probably not things that translate well into language. What is known is that they involve exposure to exactly the kind of horror that Grey Knight service will regularly produce, calibrated at escalating intensities, designed to identify the point at which any given candidate's resistance fails. Psychic attacks, simulating demonic contact, exposure to the kind of corrupting spiritual pressure that emanates from genuine warp entities, scenarios designed to exploit whatever particular vulnerabilities a given candidate carries, the fears and guilts and shames and hungers that live in the deep places of any human psychology, and present those vulnerabilities in the most tempting and most overwhelming form available to the chapter's extraordinary psychic expertise. The training fields of Titan are, according to certain references in the lore, literally covered in the bones of aspirants who did not make it through. This is not metaphorical. The failures die. The trials are not adjusted to allow for failure to be survivable. Either you are what the Grey Knights need, or you are not. And if you are not, the chapter does not particularly need you to survive the discovery of that fact. This is brutal in a way that requires sitting with. Other chapters are protective of their aspirants to a degree. They invest significant resources in selection and early training precisely because every successful Space Marine represents an enormous biological and cultural investment that you do not simply discard casually. The Grey Knights are not cavalier about the deaths of aspirants, exactly, but they are operating from the position that the alternative to thorough testing is worse. A Grey Knight who fails in the field, who cracks under the psychic pressure of a genuine demonic encounter, and becomes either a casualty or, more catastrophically, a source of contamination or corruption, is a worse outcome than any number of aspirants who died, proving they were not adequate to the task. The chapter is not cruel. It simply has very specific requirements that cannot be compromised without undermining the entire purpose for which it exists. For the candidates who survive, who pass the rituals, who are judged adequate, what comes next is a set of procedures that are equally remarkable. They receive the gene seed. They receive the biological transformation that makes them Space Marines, with all of that tremendous complexity, and they receive it at a level of biological engineering sophistication that goes beyond what most chapters have access to, partly because of Titan's proximity to Mars and the ancient agreements the chapter maintains with the Adeptus Mechanicus, and partly because the resources of the Ordo Malleus are directed specifically toward ensuring that the Grey Knights have access to the best of everything that the Imperium can provide. Silver purity wards are implanted beneath the skin, covering the entire body. These are not decorative. They are psychic circuit breakers, literal hexagrammic and pentagrammic wards worked in precious metal and inscribed at the chemical level with the same kind of protective formulae that appear on the armor and weapons of a full Grey Knight, providing a layer of anti-demonic protection that is, in a very real sense, part of the warrior's body rather than something he puts on. The wards cover every inch of skin beneath the armor. They are there because the flesh itself, the literal body of a Grey Knight, is considered a psychically significant space that requires its own warding. Then the memories go. This is perhaps the most unsettling element of the whole process, and the one that raises the most uncomfortable questions about what it means to choose this path, or whether it can meaningfully be called a choice at all. Grey Knights aspirants have the majority of their prior memories and personality erased, not dimmed or suppressed or rearranged, but genuinely removed, as completely as the extraordinary psychosurgical capabilities of the chapter can manage. The justification offered is a combination of security and resilience. Security, because a Grey Knight who retains vivid memories of a family, a homeworld, friends, loves, the ordinary human connective tissue of a life, represents a potential psychic vulnerability that a demonic entity could exploit, reaching into those memories and using the emotional attachments they carry as leverage. Resilience, because the kind of total commitment the chapter demands is easier to maintain in a warrior who does not carry the weight of a prior identity, who is, in some fundamental sense, only what the Grey Knights have made him, only the warrior and the ward and the weapon. During training, recruits are referred to by numbers rather than names. Only upon successful completion of the process, only when the chapter is satisfied that what stands before them is genuinely a Grey Knight, rather than simply a man who has survived the making of one, does the new warrior receive a name. Not his original name, a new one, a name that belongs to the Grey Knight rather than to the person who began the process. There is something in this that asks you to consider what identity means in a context where identity is literally manufactured as part of a military production process, where the self that emerges at the end is deliberately different from the self that went in, shaped by the chapter's requirements, rather than by the ordinary messy accumulation of experience and relationship and choice that constitutes a human life. The Grey Knights are not unaware of the weight of this. It is not a thoughtless practice, but it is a practice, and it has been maintained for 10,000 years because the alternative, the possibility of a Grey Knight who cracks, who gives the warp something to work with, is considered too catastrophic to risk for the sake of the ordinary human dignity of the individuals involved. The psychic training that runs alongside the physical and ritualistic elements of the initiation process deserves particular attention because it is arguably the most demanding and most distinctive element of what the chapter asks of its warriors. Every Grey Knight must learn to maintain the Aegis, not just in moments of stillness or focused concentration, but in the middle of combat, under psychic assault, from entities that are specifically trying to find the gaps in their mental defenses. They must learn the 6 chants of denial, which are formulae for rejecting psychic intrusion from specific categories of warp-born entity. They must learn the 7 words of life and death, which relates to the chapter's specific theological understanding of what it means to exist on the border between the material and the immaterial. They must learn the 8 songs of battle, which are psychic harmonics that can be used in conjunction with nemesis weapons to enhance their effectiveness. And they must learn the 9 terrible spells that form the basis of all the chapter's active psychic offensive capability, the foundations from which the more advanced and specialized applications of psychic power are derived. The librarians of the chapter, who are the senior psychers tasked among other things with training new initiates, are described in the available sources as taking the position that it is better for a weak recruit to die at their hands during training than to reach active service and imperil the chapter through inadequacy. This is not a threat or a boast. It is a statement of policy, and the training fields of Titan are the physical evidence that it is policy sincerely maintained. The bones of failed aspirants mark the ground of Titan's training facilities, not as trophies, but as simple, quiet testament to the reality that the standards required are not flexible. The galaxy does not become less dangerous because a given aspirant was not quite good enough. The demons that the chapter fights do not make allowances for warriors who are almost capable of handling them. Beyond the psychic training, each Grey Knight must develop what might be called demonological literacy, a working knowledge of the specific characteristics, capabilities, names, and weaknesses of the major categories of demonic entity that they are likely to encounter. This is not simply memorizing a bestiary. Understanding a daemon, in the sense required for effective combat against it, means understanding something about the warp power it serves, the emotional reality it embodies, the specific ways in which it tries to exploit the minds and bodies of the material beings it encounters. Cornate daemons relate to rage and slaughter and the pure animal pleasure of violence, and engaging with them requires a warrior who will not be drawn into mirroring their rage, who maintains enough tactical clarity in the midst of their assault to use the specific vulnerabilities that their focus on direct overwhelming force leaves open. Tsientian daemons relate to manipulation and change, and the specific pleasure of complexity for its own sake. And fighting them requires a different set of mental disciplines entirely, ones oriented toward detecting and resisting the kind of layered misdirection that a Lord of Change deploys in ways that a bloodthirster would find irrelevant. The practical application of all of this training becomes visible in the way the Grey Knights actually fight, which is different in recognizable ways from the way standard Space Marines engage. They move with a deliberateness that is not slowness, a quality of knowing exactly where they are going and why that reads to observers as a kind of inevitability. They speak during combat, not the battle cries and chapter slogans that most Astartes use to psychologically reinforce their own aggression, but the specific prayers and chants and binding formulae of their demonological training, words that do actual work in the psychic environment of a demonic engagement, rather than simply expressing emotional states. When a squad of Grey Knights locks psychic gifts together in what the chapter calls a gestalt, when they synchronize their individual psychic presences into a collective expression of directed will, the result is something that functions as a genuine force multiplier in ways that go beyond the ordinary tactical benefit of teamwork. The more Grey Knights present in a single engagement, the stronger this gestalt effect becomes, and the more effectively they can suppress, banish, and destroy demonic entities that individual warriors of any kind would struggle against. Section 6. The Citadel of Titan, a fortress built on forbidden knowledge. If you could somehow approach Titan from outside, if you could somehow get past the wards and the misdirection and the layers of deliberate unintelligibility that the chapter wraps around its home, and find yourself looking at the Citadel of Titan from the outside, what you would see would be something cut entirely from black basalt. not built in the sense of stones being fitted together by hands and mortar and the application of engineering principles, but carved in the way you carve away everything that is not what you want and leave only what remains. The fortress emerges from the rock of Titan like an intention made physical. It is exactly as large as it needs to be, and no larger, which is still very large indeed, and it has the quality that the most functional places often have, the quality of not caring at all whether it impresses you, of being completely absorbed in its purpose. The outer appearance is forbidding in the way that things are forbidding, when they are genuinely dangerous rather than simply trying to appear so. The towers are not decorative. They are observation points and weapons platforms, and the physical anchors for layers of psychic warding that begin at the walls and extend outward into the space around the moon in concentric fields of diminishing intensity. Within those fields, demonic entities find real space increasingly uncomfortable. The pain they experience is not a side effect, it is a feature. The librarians who maintain the wards understand exactly what effect the fields produce on warp-born entities, and they design and maintain those effects with precision. The interior of the Citadel of Titan is, by the accounts that exist in the limited literature that describes it at all, an extraordinary environment. Within the fortress hang banners and pennants and flags, representing the victories and the sacrifices of the chapter in its long war, none of which would be recognizable to anyone outside the Grey Knights or the highest echelons of the Ordo Malleus. The battles they commemorate are battles that do not officially exist. The names they record are names that appear in no publicly accessible history. Looking at those banners without context would be like looking at an honors board in a language you have never encountered, knowing that the information is significant and being entirely unable to access it. Beneath the fortress lies a crypt that extends deep into the rock of Titan, cool and damp, housing the armored remains of Grey Knights who have served and fallen over the 10 millennia of the chapter's existence. Many of the oldest sarcophagi belong to warriors whose names and deeds are genuinely unknown, even within the chapter, the records having been lost or deliberately destroyed over the passage of time. These are, in a very real sense, the chapter's greatest secrets, even from itself. The specific nature of the heroism they represent exists only in the abstract, in the knowledge that these warriors died in the chapter's service and therefore died in the Emperor's service, and that this is sufficient, regardless of whether the specific details of how they did it can be reconstructed. Above, at the height of the tallest tower, sits the augurium. This is the working space of the prognosticars, those Grey Knights who have developed their psychic gifts specifically in the direction of foresight and prescience, who spend their time in the deep and difficult work of reading the possible futures that the warp makes accessible to sufficiently gifted perception. This is not a comfortable gift. Looking forward along the branching paths of time, especially in the 41st millennium, where the sheer volume of violence and psychic disturbance makes reliable prediction extraordinarily difficult, is work that erodes the practitioner. The prognosticars generally have the look of people who have seen too much of things that have not happened yet to be entirely comfortable in the present. They are nevertheless invaluable because the Grey Knight's ability to respond to demonic incursions before those incursions become unmanageable depends significantly on knowing where to look before the problem becomes visible by ordinary means. The Librarium Daemonica is perhaps the most significant space in the entire Citadel, and it is certainly the most dangerous. The Imperium's foremost repository of daemonological knowledge, it houses tens of thousands of ancient texts, accumulated over 10 millennia of engagement with the warp and its inhabitants, tomes that would destroy the minds of ordinary readers simply by being read. Codices of daemon lore so comprehensive and so specific that possessing them would be considered evidence of heresy by virtually any other arm of the Inquisition. The true names of entities that, spoken aloud by someone who understood what they were doing, could be used to bind or destroy beings of immense power. The Grey Knights use this knowledge. This is important to understand, because it represents a significant departure from the approach most of the Imperium takes to daemonic matters. The ordinary Imperial response to daemonic contact is to minimize it, to avoid engagement with daemonic lore wherever possible, to treat the very knowledge of demons as contaminating, and to handle it with the same caution you would apply to live toxins. The Grey Knights take the opposite view. You cannot fight something you do not understand. You cannot develop effective countermeasures against an enemy whose capabilities you have not studied. The fact that studying that enemy is dangerous, that the knowledge is in some sense loaded, that reading the Librarium Daemonica is not a neutral act in the way that reading an ordinary library is a neutral act, is simply a cost of doing business. The Grey Knights trust their own resilience enough to handle the knowledge, and they have been right about that for 10,000 years. The Chambers of Purity are the other major secured area within the Citadel. These are the vaults where artifacts tainted by demonic contact or warp corruption are stored, sealed away from the general population of the galaxy where they might cause harm, but retained rather than destroyed, because destruction is often either impossible or counterproductive. Some daemon weapons cannot be destroyed, as the chapter's experience with the Black Blade of Antwire demonstrates very clearly. Some artifacts retain value even after having been tainted, providing either intelligence about daemonic capabilities or potential operational utility in specific circumstances. The Chambers of Purity are heavily warded, monitored continuously, and accessed only under strictly controlled conditions by warriors of sufficient psychic resilience to handle proximity to what they contain. The Forge World of Deimos hangs in orbit over Titan, a moon of a moon in practical terms, and it is here that most of the Grey Knight's extraordinary equipment is produced. The relationship between the chapter and the Adeptus Mechanicus has been carefully maintained over 10 millennia, because the quality of the equipment the Grey Knights require is simply not achievable through ordinary channels. The hexagrammic wards that must be worked into every piece of armor, the psychic circuitry that must be embedded in every weapon, the specific metallurgy and spiritual preparation that goes into producing the silver and other materials used in Grey Knight war gear, all of this requires a level of combined technological and psychic sophistication that essentially necessitates a dedicated production facility maintained by tech priests who understand exactly what they are producing and why. The chapter operates in what could only be described as oppressive secrecy. Not just secrecy from the general population, which is standard for the Ordo Malleus, but secrecy from the broader apparatus of the Imperium itself. The Grey Knights are not answerable to the High Lords of Terra in the way that other institutions are. They are not subject to the Adeptus Administratum's oversight, not subject to the political calculations that govern most decisions about Imperial military deployment. They answer to the Ordo Malleus, and, through the Ordo Malleus, to the Emperor, in whatever sense the currently enthroned Emperor can be said to be directing policy. This independence is both a strength and a source of tension that periodically becomes very visible, as the history of the chapter's interactions with other Space Marine chapters makes clear. Section 7. Silver Armor and Living Weapons, the Gear of the Grey Knights. There is a reason the Grey Knights wear silver. Not just aesthetic preference, not tradition for its own sake, not the kind of color coding that makes armies recognizable on a battlefield. Silver, in the psychic grammar that the Ordo Malleus has spent 10,000 years developing and refining, is meaningful. It does not come from any simple superstition about silver and the supernatural, though the connection between silver and protection from malevolent beings runs deep in human mythology across many cultures. It comes from a very specific understanding of how psychic warding works, of how certain materials interact with warp energies, and of how the visual presentation of a warrior who represents the Emperor's will against the demonic carries its own kind of power in an engagement where reality itself is a contested space. The armor worn by a Grey Knight is called Aegis armor, and the name is descriptive rather than simply evocative. Every suit is inscribed with psychic wards, layer upon layer of hexagrammic and pentagrammic symbols worked into the ceramite itself at the molecular level, inscribed in a process that is as much ritual as it is manufacturing, that involves the active participation of the armor's eventual wearer in order to attune the wards to his specific psychic signature. The armor knows its owner. This is not entirely metaphorical. The psychic circuitry worked into the armor interacts with the wearer's own psychic presence in a way that makes each suit unique. That means a Grey Knight's armor will not function at full capability for anyone else, and that means the loss of a suit is not just a material loss, but a psychic one, the breaking of a connection between warrior and protection that took years to properly establish. The wards themselves function as a constant, active psychic defense. Every Grey Knight maintains something called the Aegis, a halo of protective psychic energy channeled through those wards that makes the warrior fundamentally repellent to demonic entities. Not just resistant, not just protected in the sense of being difficult to harm, actually, deeply, at the level of the demonic entity's most fundamental instincts, repellent. A daemon that attempts to approach a Grey Knight at close range is fighting against everything in its nature. The psychic presence of a fully warded Grey Knight is described in the lore as anathema to warp-born entities, something that occupies a similar conceptual space to the relationship between holy fire and corruption. It hurts, it pushes, it tells the daemon that this is not a space in which it belongs. The weapon that defines the Grey Knights, visually and tactically, is the Nemesis Force weapon. Every Grey Knight, from the newest initiate to the Supreme Grand Master, carries one. They take various forms: halberds, swords, maces, axes, hammers, the great force staves of the librarians, but they share certain fundamental characteristics. Each one is a force weapon in the technical Warhammer 40,000 sense, meaning it is a weapon that can be charged with psychic energy by its wielder to massively amplify its destructive potential, specifically in ways that are particularly effective against warp-based entities. But a Nemesis weapon is more than a standard force weapon. Each one contains a psi matrix, a carefully crafted psychic component that is attuned over time to the specific psychic signature of its owner, that grows more powerful as the warrior who carries it grows more powerful. That is, in a genuine sense, an extension of the warrior's psychic presence, rather than simply a tool he picks up and puts down. The power of a Nemesis Force weapon scales directly with the psychic power of the wielder. A junior initiate's Nemesis sword is formidable. A Grand Master's Nemesis halberd, wielded by someone who has spent decades or centuries developing their psychic gifts through combat with entities that exist on the cutting edge of what the warp can produce, is something categorically different. The weapon responds not just to the input of psychic energy, but to the will behind it, to the specific intent of destruction directed at a specific type of enemy. Against a demon, a Nemesis weapon wielded by an experienced Grey Knight is among the most destructive tools the Imperium possesses, functioning not just as a physical weapon, but as a direct intervention in the warp-based processes that allow a demonic entity to maintain its form in real space. This is complemented by the wrist-mounted storm bolter that every Grey Knight carries as standard, though older designs incorporated the bolter directly into the haft of the Nemesis weapon in a way that echoed the guardian spears of the Adeptus Custodes. The rounds in a Grey Knight's storm bolter are not standard bolts. They are inscribed with hexagrammic wards and blessed through rituals that imbue them with psychic significance before they are ever chambered. Being shot by a Grey Knight's bolter is not exactly the same experience as being shot by a standard Astartes bolter, even though the basic mechanism of a mass-reactive bolt round is the same. The difference lies in what happens at the moment of impact at the psychic level. Beyond their standard weaponry, the Grey Knights have access to a range of specialist equipment that reflects their specific mission. Incinerators, which are heavy flamers adapted to produce psychically charged fire, particularly effective against demonic entities. Silencers, weapons that fire a directed burst of suppressed psychic energy that is specifically destructive to the kind of warp-based coherence that allows a daemon to remain manifest in real space. Psi cannons, more powerful variants that fire rounds charged with psychic energy, hitting demons where they are structurally vulnerable in ways that ordinary ammunition simply does not. The Nemesis Dread Knight is perhaps the most visually striking piece of technology the chapter deploys. An exoframe worn by a Grey Knight, designed to allow a single warrior to engage greater demons on something approaching equal terms. Greater daemons are titanic entities, the direct physical manifestations of the warp powers themselves, beings of enormous size and almost incomprehensible destructive capability. The ordinary response to encountering one in the field is to throw entire armies at it and hope. The Grey Knights, characteristically, decided that what was needed was a single, very powerful warrior in a very powerful suit who could simply walk up and engage it directly. The Nemesis Dread Knight wears its pilot on the front of its chest, rather than enclosing him entirely, which looks alarming and is designed to allow the wearer's psychic gifts to function without the interference that full enclosure sometimes causes. There are also the more subtle tools of the demonologist's art, the various grenades and specialized munitions, the psychic hoods that amplify a librarian's powers, the scrolls of binding formulae that can be read aloud during combat to interfere with a daemon's ability to maintain coherence. All of it is produced on Deimos, maintained with the kind of meticulous, religiously inflected care that the Adeptus Mechanicus lavishes on any significant piece of machinery, and blessed at multiple stages of production through ceremonies that would look, to an outside observer, like an extremely earnest combination of engineering, QC inspection, and high religious ritual. The whole arsenal, taken together, is the most comprehensively daemon-specific military equipment package in the Imperium. Nothing else comes close. Nothing else was built with this specific purpose in mind across every element of every system. And the warriors who carry it are the only humans in the Imperium who have the psychic capacity to use all of it at full capability, making the Grey Knights not just the best option for what they do, but the only viable option in many situations. Section 8. Brothers in Silver. The Order and its Champions. The Grey Knights are organized differently from standard Codex Astartes chapters, which is itself an interesting statement about the nature of their purpose. Robert Guillemot's great work, the Codex Astartes, was designed to prevent any single Space Marine chapter from ever again accumulating the kind of power that the old Space Marine legions had wielded, the kind that had made the traitor legions so catastrophically dangerous when they turned against the Imperium. It imposed a specific organizational structure, a 10-company format with clear divisions of function and leadership that made it possible for the Imperium to understand and monitor what any given chapter was capable of. Most chapters follow this structure with varying degrees of fidelity. The Grey Knights have 8 brotherhoods instead of 10 companies, and the lineage of those 8 brotherhoods traces directly to the 8 founding Grand Masters, whom Malcador brought to Titan. Each brotherhood has a specific character, shaped by its founding Grand Master, and maintained through its history in a living tradition, rather than just an organizational chart. The first brotherhood is the primary home of the chapter's pilots and vehicle crews. The 7th Brotherhood maintains the closest ongoing relationship with the Inquisition and handles the storage and management of intelligence about specific Inquisitors and their activities, which sounds potentially sinister, but is primarily a security measure. The 8th Brotherhood is generally where new recruits are first assigned after completing their training, learning the practical realities of the chapter's service before potentially being reassigned to other brotherhoods as they develop. At the top of this structure is the Supreme Grand Master, elected unanimously by the 8 Grand Masters who lead the brotherhoods. The requirement for unanimity is not an accident. It serves as a significant structural safeguard, ensuring that no individual can seize the chapter's highest office without the genuine support of all 8 of his peers. The Grey Knights have enough power to cause very significant problems if that power were ever directed improperly, and the unanimity requirement means that the likelihood of that happening is dramatically reduced by the simple math of needing to convince 8 extraordinarily capable, deeply skeptical, highly experienced individuals simultaneously. The current Supreme Grand Master, at the end of the 41st millennium, is Kaldor Drygo. We will spend significant time on Drygo specifically later in this telling, because his story is remarkable and strange, even by the standards of a chapter that practically specializes in remarkable and strange. For now, the organizational point that matters is that Drygo holds this position while also being, for complex reasons, not entirely available to exercise it in the conventional sense. His situation is one of the more genuinely unusual things about the current state of the Grey Knights. Below the Grand Masters are the Brother Captains, who lead individual Brotherhood elements, then the Justicars, who lead squads, then the regular Battle Brothers organized into the various squad types that reflect the chapter's tactical doctrine. Strike squads are the primary tactical formation, flexible and mobile, capable of deep striking via teleportation into the middle of an engagement zone. This ability to teleport, to remove themselves from physical space, and reinsert at a designated location is used far more extensively by the Grey Knights than by any other chapter, partly because of the psychic enhancements that make it safer and more reliable, and partly because the nature of their mission often requires getting to a specific place very quickly and without the kind of approach that would give an already established demonic presence time to prepare. Interceptor squads are specifically optimized for rapid repositioning, using a capability called the warp shunt to make extremely fast movements across a battlefield that regular teleportation cannot match in terms of speed, if not in terms of precision. Purgation squads are heavy weapons specialists, deploying the incinerators and psi cannons in numbers sufficient to deal with large concentrations of demonic entities that might otherwise simply absorb individual weapon fire without meaningful damage accumulating. Terminator squads are the heavy close combat element, paladins, the absolute elite within that elite. The paladins deserve specific attention because they represent the peak of what the chapter considers its finest warriors outside of the Grand Masters themselves. A paladin is a Grey Knight who has demonstrated through sustained excellence over a long career that he is among the most capable warriors the chapter possesses. They operate in squads that function as the chapter's equivalent of Terminator Honor Guard, and they carry the most powerful configurations of Nemesis weaponry, their psychic gifts having been developed to a degree that makes each of them genuinely dangerous to opponents that would be catastrophic encounters for most warriors. Then, there are the two specialist orders that exist outside the Brotherhood structure, but within the chapter: the Purifiers and the Paladins as an elite tier, with the Purifiers being the more unusual of the two. The Order of the Purifiers is described in the lore as consisting of those Grey Knights who have attained a degree of purity that goes beyond even the extraordinary standards of the chapter at large. They are not just incorruptible in the sense that all Grey Knights are incorruptible. They are incorruptible in a sense that goes beyond the biological and psychic protections of the gene seed and the training and the wards, something that exists at the level of fundamental character, an irreducible will toward the good that cannot be reached by any means. The warp has tried in 10,000 years of trying. The Purifiers live in the chambers of purity, which is not coincidental. They are the guardians of those chambers, the ones trusted with proximity to the worst artifacts that the chapter has recovered, precisely because they are the ones least likely to be affected by that proximity. The Brotherhood champion of the Purifiers is Garen Crow, Castellan of the Order, a warrior whose specific claim to fame is being the current bearer of an object called the Black Blade of Antwire, which is one of the more elegant and quietly terrifying concepts in the Grey Knight's lore. The Black Blade of Antwire is a daemon weapon, specifically a daemon sword, meaning it is a physical weapon that contains a bound demonic entity whose power can theoretically be wielded by whoever carries the blade, at the cost of being in constant psychic contact with a being of immense malevolent will that is entirely devoted to escaping its prison and to corrupting whoever has the audacity to think they can control it. Daemon weapons are genuinely powerful and genuinely extremely dangerous, and the Grey Knights have tried to destroy the Black Blade of Antwire by every method they could devise, and failed at every attempt, which tells you something about the specific nature of the entity bound within it. The blade cannot be sealed away in the chambers of purity either. It is too potent for that. Its influence would seep through any warding that the chamber could reasonably maintain and corrupt the Guardians over time. The solution the chapter arrived at was simple and very Grey Knight in its logic. Give the sword to the purest soul in the chapter. Let the most incorruptible warrior available serve as its permanent bearer, because the constant psychic warfare involved in simply carrying the thing is less dangerous in his hands than in anyone else's. Let Garen Crow carry it, and fight its influence every moment of every day for as long as he lives, because the alternative is worse. Crow has never drawn the blade's power. He uses it as a physical weapon, relying on his own skill rather than the demonic enhancement the blade offers. The entity within the sword tries constantly. It whispers, it offers, it bargains, it threatens. It shifts tactics endlessly, trying approaches that might find a crack in Crow's defenses, trying to identify the specific vulnerability that every soul supposedly possesses if you only apply the right pressure in the right way. Crow does not crack, and he has been doing this for long enough that the relationship between him and the trapped demon within his blade has the quality of a very long, very one-sided argument in which one party is willing to continue indefinitely and the other party has simply declined to engage on terms the first party can use. Brother Captain Arvin Stern is another notable figure from the chapter's recent history, a warrior who carries a specific and unusual kind of misfortune. After banishing a greater daemon of Tsiench, specifically a Lord of Change, the entity managed as it dissolved back into the warp to put something on Stern, not a curse exactly, not in the simple evil wish sense, but something more subtle and more persistent, a kind of attention. Events of specific significance tend to cluster around Arvon Stern. Chaos forces of Tsiench, in particular, seem to find him disproportionately often. He is the thread that keeps appearing in situations that should, statistically, have nothing to do with each other, and the interpretation of whether this is a curse or a mark, or simply the Lord of Change's way of keeping a useful instrument close at hand, has been debated within the Ordo Malleus without resolution. Section 9. The price of secrecy, mind wipes, massacres, and the months of shame. There is a version of the Grey Knight's story that is simply heroic. Secret warriors fighting impossible battles against the worst things in existence, never asking for recognition, never seeking glory, standing between humanity and annihilation out of pure duty and the deep, incorruptible commitment to the Emperor's will. That version is true, but it is not the whole truth. And the Grey Knights would probably be the first to tell you, if they were inclined to tell you anything, that the truth they operate within is considerably more complicated. The policy of the Ordo Malleus regarding witnesses to demonic incursion is very simple and very brutal. People who see demons, who witness the reality of what the Inquisition spends enormous resources trying to keep invisible, are a problem. The existence of that knowledge in an ordinary human mind is not just a security issue in the sense of information that could spread if the person talks about it. It is, potentially, a genuine psychic vulnerability. A person who has experienced the reality of demonic incursion at close range carries the memory of that experience in a mind that was not designed or prepared for it. That memory is a kind of opening, a way in, for entities that communicate through psychic pressure and exploit the damage that exposure to their reality leaves in ordinary human psychology. The Ordo Malleus responds to this with policies that range from aggressive to absolute. At the minimum, survivors of demonic incursions who are not Adeptus Astartes are mind-wiped, their memories of the event removed as completely as the Inquisition's considerable psychosurgical capabilities allow. If the memory cannot be safely removed, if it is too deeply embedded, if the person's psychology has been too thoroughly altered by what they experienced, the Inquisition considers more permanent solutions. This is presented internally as a mercy, and, in the specific moral calculus of the Ordo Malleus, it is probably genuinely considered as such. A person whose mind has been opened to the warp in a way that cannot be healed is a risk to themselves and to everyone around them. The Inquisition's response is efficient and final. This extends to entire populations in the most severe cases. If a world experiences a significant demonic incursion and a sufficient portion of the population has been exposed to it, the Inquisition's calculation sometimes arrives at the conclusion that large-scale population management is required. This is not exterminatus in most cases, not the destruction of the entire world, but it is sterilization of the exposed population, internment, the kind of aggressive social engineering that treats living human beings as variables in a security equation rather than as people whose lives have intrinsic value. The imperial citizenry, by and large, does not know this is happening to them when it happens. They are told whatever story produces the required compliance, and the Grey Knights are sometimes the instrument by which this happens. This is where the heroic narrative develops complications. The event known as the First War for Armageddon, which took place in the year 444 of the 41st millennium, is the most visible example of what happens when the Grey Knights' methods of secrecy maintenance come into conflict with the values of other Space Marine chapters. Armageddon was invaded by a force of chaos under the ultimate direction of the Daemon Primarch Angron, the Red Angel, the Gene Father of the World Eaters, a Primarch who had fallen to Khorne before his own legion was fully established, and who had spent 10,000 years of demonic existence, becoming something even more terrible than what he had been. 109 Grey Knights Terminators teleported directly into the heart of the Chaos Army. They engaged Angron and his bodyguard of a dozen bloodthirsters, which are among the most powerful demonic entities that Khorne can manifest, simultaneously. They suffered catastrophic casualties. Angron's black blade killed Grey Knights with every stroke. But a young recruit named Hyperion, showing a degree of psychic power that had not been fully appreciated before the crisis demanded it, was able to shatter the black blade through sheer psychic force. And Brother Captain Terramar Aurelian, at the cost of his own life, banished Angron back to the warp for 100 years and a day. The Grey Knights won. The battle on Armageddon was a victory. Angron was gone. The Chaos Forces were defeated by the combined efforts of the Grey Knights, the Space Wolves under Logan Grimnar, and the Imperial Guard defenders. The world was saved. Then, the Ordo Malleus began the cleanup operation. The survivors of Armageddon, the Imperial Guard soldiers who had fought alongside the Space Wolves, who had seen the demonic incursion at close range, who knew what they had faced, were to be managed in accordance with standard Ordo Malleus policy. They were to be interned, sterilized, their memories suppressed or removed. They would not be killed outright, at least not most of them, but their lives as they had known them were effectively over. Their service and their sacrifice, and the extraordinary courage they had shown in the face of something that should, by any reasonable expectation, have broken them entirely, counted for nothing in the security calculation that the Ordo Malleus was running. Logan Grimnar found this unacceptable. The great wolf of the Space Wolves had fought on Armageddon. He had seen what those soldiers had done. He had watched ordinary human beings hold ground against horrors that would have cost most chapters considerable numbers of Astartes, and he had developed something approaching genuine respect for the people who had stood with him. When the Inquisition's forces began their cleanup operations, Grimnar intervened. He told the Ordo Malleus that his Space Wolves would not allow this. He began organizing the evacuation of survivors, putting Space Wolves' vessels between the inquisitorial ships and the transports carrying the people they were trying to prevent from leaving. What followed became known in the records of the Grey Knights as the Months of Shame, a period of military confrontation between the Space Wolves and an inquisitorial force supported by the Grey Knights and the Red Hunters chapter that escalated rapidly toward genuine open warfare between armies that were all, technically, servants of the same emperor. The Grey Knights' flagship, the Glaive of Janus, a vessel that had served the chapter's first brotherhood for 10,000 years, was destroyed in this conflict, along with its entire crew and more than 50 veteran Grey Knights. This was not an abstract casualty. 10 millennia of continuous service, the accumulated history and experience of an irreplaceable group of warriors, ended because of a confrontation with another chapter that was, from a certain point of view, simply refusing to accept the necessary costs of the Grey Knights' mission. The conflict did not end in the way that most military conflicts end, with one side achieving decisive victory over the other. It ended through negotiation, through a compromise that was humiliating for the Inquisition, in the sense that the Space Wolves did not simply back down, and that resulted in a permanent change to the relationship between the Grey Knights and the Space Wolves that persists to this day. Logan Grimnar is still the great wolf of the Space Wolves in the current era. He has not forgotten Armageddon. And when the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights find themselves in the same operational theater, the working relationship between them is functional, but carries the weight of what happened in the months after that particular victory. This is the difficult moral territory that the Grey Knights occupy. Their secrecy is not arbitrary. It serves a genuine purpose, protecting the psychic health of the general population and preventing knowledge that could cause catastrophic harm from spreading in uncontrolled ways. But that secrecy is maintained through methods that, applied to individuals rather than abstract security principles, look very much like treating human beings as acceptable collateral damage in a security operation. The people being mind-wiped, or worse, were not enemies. They were civilians and soldiers who had done nothing wrong except being in the wrong place when the warp tore open. Their suffering is real. Their losses are real. And the Grey Knights, who are in some sense responsible for those losses, even when they are not the direct instruments of them, have to live with the fact that their mission requires this. The Ordo Malleus has written extensively about the ethical justifications for these policies, and those justifications are not entirely without force. In a galaxy where the spread of demonic knowledge genuinely does carry the risk of making demonic incursions more likely by providing the warp with more material to work with, where the corruption of individual minds can and does lead to catastrophic larger-scale events, the argument for aggressive secrecy maintenance is not simply a rationalization for institutional cruelty. There is a genuine security logic, but security logic is not the same as human dignity, and the Grey Knights are an organization that has chosen to prioritize one over the other with the kind of consistency that can only be maintained by people who are, by design, less susceptible than ordinary humans to the emotional weight of what that choice means for the individuals affected by it. It is a darkness that sits alongside the genuine heroism, and the Grey Knights, to their credit in the lore that touches on their self-understanding, are not entirely unaware of it. The months of shame produced changes, not dramatic institutional ones, not the kind of sudden reversal that a more flexible organization might have implemented to respond to the clear demonstration that their methods could generate serious opposition from allied forces. But changes nonetheless. The specific resolution that ended the standoff between the Space Wolves and the Inquisitorial forces included an agreement that the Space Wolves, who had witnessed the Grey Knights during the campaign, rather than being subjected to standard mind wipe protocols, would instead have the chapter's existence and mission explained to them by a Grey Knight directly. This was a significant concession. The knowledge of the Grey Knights is supposed to be restricted to a very specific and very controlled set of people. The Space Wolves who fought on Armageddon were not in that set. Extending the explanation to them, rather than simply eliminating the knowledge through psychosurgery, represented an acknowledgement that the Inquisition's methods of maintaining secrecy had limits that became unworkable when they generated the kind of response Logan Grimnar was willing to mount. What this means for the chapter's longer-term approach to secrecy maintenance has been a matter of internal debate within the Ordo Malleus ever since. Some Inquisitors take the position that Armageddon demonstrated the need for more aggressive and more decisive action against witnesses, specifically to prevent situations where witnesses survive long enough to organize resistance to the cleanup operations. Others take the position that Armageddon demonstrated the opposite, that the standard approach generates exactly the kind of high-profile confrontation that is most damaging to the chapter's effective anonymity. Neither position has fully prevailed. The chapter continues to operate with the same fundamental approach to witness management that it has always used, but with perhaps slightly more awareness of the situations in which that approach generates more exposure than the witness management itself was trying to prevent. The relationship between the Grey Knights and other Space Marine chapters is, consequently, complicated in ways that the straightforward organizational description does not fully capture. Most chapters do not officially know the Grey Knights exist. Some, through various means, including Armageddon, do know. Among those that know, reactions range from the grudging respect of the Ultramarines, who understand the necessity of the Ordo Malleus's work, even if they find some of its methods uncomfortable, to the open disdain of the Space Wolves, for whom the months of shame represent a grievance that Logan Grimnar has made very clear, will not simply dissolve with the passage of time. The chapter navigates these relationships with the same careful pragmatism it applies to everything, maintaining the working relationships required for effective operations, while not offering the kind of transparency that might either generate useful goodwill or catastrophically compromise their security profile. Section 10. The Greatest Battles, Armageddon, Pandarax, and Beyond. The history of the Grey Knights is a history that, by design, reads as a series of gaps. Official records show that things happened, that threats were addressed, that worlds were saved from things that those worlds' inhabitants are not supposed to know they were in danger from. The details are classified at a level that makes most other inquisitorial classifications look accessible by comparison. But enough leaks through, enough is recorded in sources that the chapter cannot or chooses not to fully suppress, that a rough shape of the chapter's military history is discernible. We have already covered the First War for Armageddon and its extraordinarily complicated aftermath. But Armageddon was not the only significant engagement in the chapter's history, where the Grey Knights demonstrated their unique capabilities against enemies that no other force could adequately address. The Pandarax campaign, of the years 959 to 961 of the 41st millennium, is one of the more detailed accounts of Grey Knight's operational methodology, partly because it involved the cooperation of the Dark Angels chapter in a way that made the operations less completely suppressible than most. Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, the successor to Horus's legacy as the galaxy's foremost servant of the ruinous powers, led an alliance of traitor legions into the Pandorax system with a specific objective. Beneath the surface of the death world of Pythos lay something called the Damnation Cache, an ancient, stable portal to the warp, dating from the period of the Horus heresy that had been sealed and warded in the aftermath of that conflict. Abaddon wanted to open it. The implications of a stable, large-scale warp portal opened by chaos forces in a populated Imperial sector were, to put it very lightly, catastrophic. The Grey Knights knew about the Damnation Cache. They were, in fact, the only significant Imperial force that knew about it, because knowledge of such things is exactly the kind of classified information that the Ordo Malleus maintains and does not share with other institutions. The prognosticators on Titan had been watching the situation in the Pandorax system with concern for some time before Abaddon made his move. When he did, Kaldor Drygo himself led the Grey Knights' Fifth Brotherhood to Pythos. What followed was months of brutal fighting on a world that was rapidly becoming something worse than a simple battlefield. The traitor legions had opened the Damnation Cache well enough to allow significant demonic reinforcement before the Imperial forces could close it, which meant that the engagement was simultaneously a conventional military operation against Chaos Space Marines and a demon suppression operation of the kind that only the Grey Knights were truly equipped for. The Dark Angels, who had become involved through mechanisms that are somewhat obscure in the available records, but likely involved Drygo knowing things about Azrael and the Dark Angels that gave him significant leverage, provided conventional military capability that allowed the Grey Knights to focus on the demonic elements. The story of Epimetheus is woven into the Pandorax campaign in a way that adds extraordinary depth to it. One of the original 8 founding Grand Masters of the Grey Knights had, in the chapter's first mission, after returning from the warp, volunteered to stay behind on Pythos as a guardian of the final seal on the Damnation Cache. This was not a short assignment. Epimetheus spent 10,000 years in suspended animation on Pythos, watching over the seal through the sheer depth of psychic dedication that only someone of founding Grandmaster caliber could sustain across that time span. When Abaddon's forces arrived in 959, M41 Epimetheus was still there, still holding. He was taken by Abaddon's forces when the campaign ended. The exact nature of what Abaddon intended to do with one of the founding Grey Knights and the specific psychic gifts Epimetheus possessed is described in the sources as something Abaddon considered useful for the forthcoming 13th Black Crusade. This is a detail that the Grey Knights have apparently not been able to do anything about in the years since, and it represents something genuinely painful in the chapter's history. The loss not just of a warrior, but of one of the founding members who had sacrificed 10 millennia to a specific duty and was taken despite everything. The campaign against Magnus the Red, the Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Sons, represents another significant chapter in the Grey Knights' modern history. Grandmaster Aldrich Voldus, who leads the Third Brotherhood, lost his predecessor Valdar Auricon to Magnus during an engagement that is still relatively recent in the chapter's long history. Voldus himself subsequently proved his capability in the chaos of the 13th Black Crusade, serving as a trusted advisor to the returned Primarch Robut Guillemon and deploying the chapter's forces against the demonic incursions that accompanied Abaddon's assault on Cadia and the subsequent catastrophic tearing of the peace. Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift that split the galaxy. The Great Rift is perhaps the most significant development in the Grey Knights' operational environment since the chapter's founding. The Cicatrix Maledictum is a galaxy-spanning tear in real space through which the warp bleeds permanently into the material universe, creating an environment where demonic incursions are dramatically more common, more powerful, and less predictable than anything in the chapter's previous experience. The warp storms that accompany it cut off entire sectors from communication and reinforcement. Demonic entities that would previously have required significant ritual effort to manifest in real space now appear with disturbing ease in the rift's vicinity. The scale of what the Grey Knights are being asked to respond to has expanded enormously, even as the resources available to respond have remained roughly constant. This is the environment in which the Grey Knights currently operate, in which every challenge they have faced for 10,000 years now exists in an amplified form, where the worst days of the past look almost manageable compared to the continuous crisis of the current era. And they continue, because there is no alternative. Because when the warp tears open and something comes through, the Grey Knights are what is there to push it back. The return of Angron to Armageddon in the current era of the 42nd millennium offers another example. A force of over 60 Grey Knights from the Fourth Brotherhood attempted to banish the Daemon Primarch and were all slain. This is not a small thing. 60 Grey Knights dying in a single engagement represents an enormous loss for a chapter that maintains roughly 1,000 warriors total and cannot replace them quickly. The training cycle alone, the 666 rituals of detestation, is not something you can accelerate without compromising the quality of what comes out of the process. Each of those 60 warriors represented years of preparation and decades of accumulated combat experience. Their deaths left gaps that will take time to fill and that cannot be filled in kind. And yet, Angron was eventually driven back in a subsequent engagement at the cost of Grandmaster Rothweir Morven's life. Morven sealed the Red Angel's gate at the cost of himself, personally. His life spent in the banishment ritual, in the way that the Emperor's life was spent in the confrontation with Horus. Morven did not flinch from what was required. This is what 10,000 years of Grey Knight service looks like on the ground. Individual warriors of extraordinary capability, spending themselves in acts that will never be officially acknowledged, that will never be recorded in any history the public will read, that will never earn them the kind of memorial that ordinary military heroes receive. Gone. And what they leave behind is simply the continued existence of the things they died to protect. Section 11. Kaldor Drygo, the man trapped in eternity. The story of Kaldor Drygo is either the most inspiring or the most horrifying thing in the entire Grey Knights lore, and which one it is depends entirely on your perspective and what you consider preferable fates. Drygo began his career, as many Grey Knights do, as a battle brother in the Third Brotherhood, working his way through the engagements and campaigns that form the practical education of any Grey Knight warrior. He showed particular aptitude from early in his career, the kind of consistent, exceptional performance that draws the attention of chapter leadership in an organization where every member is already exceptional by the ordinary standards of the Adeptus Astartes. His first notable appearance in the records accessible to outside sources involves a campaign against the Daemon Prince Makar the Reborn on the world of Acrylum, where Drygo, still a relatively junior warrior, successfully banished the Daemon, establishing an enmity between himself and Makar that would persist across subsequent decades as the Daemon repeatedly attempted to return. The event that defined his career and his subsequent existence came in the year 901 M41, at what the records call the Battle of Cornovin. The Daemon Primarch Mortarion, the Pale King, the Death Lord, the Gene Father of the Death Guard, had descended upon Cornovin with his forces. Mortarion is one of the most powerful entities the Warp has produced, a Primarch whose already formidable abilities have been augmented by 10,000 years of daemonic transformation under Nurgle's patronage into something genuinely apocalyptic. The Grey Knight's Supreme Grand Master at the time, a warrior named Geronatan, led the chapter's response and was killed by Mortarion during the engagement. Along with him died many other Grey Knights who attempted to banish the Daemon Primarch through conventional means. Drygo, watching his Supreme Grand Master die, did something that the available lore presents with a certain matter-of-factness that somewhat undersells its absolute audacity. He went for Mortarion directly. The Daemon Primarch had just killed the chapter's most senior warrior and was standing amid a field of Grey Knights' corpses. Drygo, at this point not yet Supreme Grand Master, not yet carrying the Titan Sword, simply engaged Mortarion one-on-one. He used the Emperor's original name for Mortarion, the true name that Mortarion had been intended to carry before the chaos of the Primarch's upbringing had reshaped everything. In the psychic grammar of the 41st millennium, true names are power. Speaking the true name of a daemonic entity in the correct form with sufficient psychic force behind it, can be profoundly disruptive to that entity's ability to maintain coherent form. The Emperor had given Mortarion a name. Drygo knew it. He spoke it. Mortarion's body was shattered. His manifestation in real space was broken. And as the Daemon Primarch dissolved back into the warp, in whatever passes for agony among beings like him, Drygo carved the name of his fallen Supreme Grand Master into Mortarion's heart. An insult and a declaration, and a memorial all at once. The kind of act that says very clearly that you do not fear this enemy and that you will go looking for them. This act has never been forgiven by Mortarion. The specific hatred that the Daemon Primarch of Nurgle carries toward Kaldor Drygo is a very personal thing. Drygo was acclaimed Supreme Grand Master unanimously by the remaining Grand Masters. He took up the Titan Sword, the chapter's most significant relic weapon, a Nemesis Force Sword of extraordinary power that serves as the mark of the chapter's highest office. And then, the events that define his current existence unfolded in the aftermath of subsequent engagements, specifically through Makar the Reborn's revenge, and through whatever mechanism eventually resulted in Drygo being cast into the warp itself. The specifics of how Drygo came to be permanently exiled in the realm of chaos are somewhat unclear in the various accounts, as tends to be the case with events involving warp-based entities who have personal reasons to interfere with the recording of accurate history. What is clear is the result. Kaldor Drygo exists in the warp. He fights there constantly, an endless war against the daemons of all four powers, alone in a dimension where everything that exists is hostile to his presence, and everything that happens is filtered through the incomprehensible physics of a non-place. Periodically, he is able to return to real space, either through his own psychic effort or because the coincidence of circumstances creates a momentary opportunity. When he returns, he fights, he leads, he does whatever needs to be done, and then he goes back. This is, taken at face value, an extraordinary burden. The warp is not a safe environment for any material being, and the stress of existing there continuously, of fighting continuously, of maintaining the psychic coherence necessary to remain himself rather than being dissolved into the warp's essential formlessness, should by any reasonable assessment be consuming him. It is the kind of existence that a warrior like Drygo was presumably not designing his career around. It is not, to put it gently, what most people would consider an ideal outcome for a life of dedicated service. And yet, in the warp, Drygo has carved the names of fallen Grey Knights into the surfaces of daemon fortresses. He has fought greater daemons of all four powers. He has wandered through territories that exist according to logic entirely alien to anything he was trained for, driven by a refusal to be consumed that the warp's powers have been unable to overcome because they are working against someone who was quite literally designed not to be consumable. Whether Drygo has found some form of adaptation to his impossible environment, some way of drawing sustenance from the continuous combat or the continuous challenge, is not something the sources are clear on. What is clear is that he has not been consumed. He has not become something other than what he is. And when he returns to real space, he is recognizably Kaldor Drygo, Supreme Grand Master, carrying 10,000 years plus of service that began before most of the chapter's current members were even recruited. He is trapped, he is suffering, probably, in ways that the available sources are not fully equipped to describe. And he is the Supreme Grand Master of an organization that cannot entirely rely on his leadership because he is not reliably present, but cannot and will not remove him from that position because he is alive and has not been replaced in any formal sense, and his authority, while difficult to exercise from the warp, has not been revoked. It is a genuinely unique organizational situation, and the chapter navigates it by operating with considerable autonomy at the Grandmaster level, while maintaining Drygo's formal authority for the occasions when he is able to return and exercise it. There is a version of Kaldor Drygo's story that is about endurance, about the thing that the Grey Knights are ultimately about, which is the refusal to be broken by what you face. Drygo faces it alone, in the most hostile environment imaginable, without the support of the chapter he leads, without the ordinary human comforts of a coherent physical environment and reliable time and the presence of allies. He faces it continuously, without the ability to withdraw or rest in any meaningful sense, without the breaks in service that even the most dedicated warriors generally get. and he is still there, still himself, still fighting. In a galaxy that is in many ways defined by the capacity of the warp powers to eventually consume anything they set their attention on, Kaldor Drygo's continued coherent existence in the warp is its own kind of statement about the nature of the Grey Knight's incorruptibility. Whether you find that inspiring or harrowing probably says something about your general disposition. Section 12. The chapter that does not exist. We come back, at the end of all of this, to the beginning, to the question of what it means to be a warrior whose very existence is a secret, whose victories are unnamed, whose sacrifices have no public memorial, whose entire purpose requires that the people they protect never fully understand what they are being protected from or who is doing the protecting. The Grey Knights occupy a very particular philosophical space within the broader story of the Imperium of mankind, and it is a space that repays attention. Most of the Imperium's great institutions are visibly, obviously, loudly what they are. The Adeptus Astartes are everywhere that the Imperium needs them, arriving with the sound of thunder and the visual language of very large armored figures in very distinctive colors, and their presence is intended to communicate something. To the defenders of whatever world they are arriving to help, the communication is salvation and the reinforcement of the Emperor's protection. To the enemies of whatever world they are arriving to defend, the communication is the arrival of something that will not negotiate and cannot be bribed, and will simply continue until either the threat is eliminated or every space marine in the engagement is dead. That communication is itself a weapon. The reputation precedes the reality. The banner carried into battle does real work by being recognized as the banner of something that has a certain kind of history. The Grey Knights cannot work this way. Their presence is not a communication tool. Their reputation, to the extent it exists only in the minds of their enemies, the daemons and the chaos-touched, and the servants of the ruinous powers who have encountered them before and carry the specific knowledge of what that encounter means. And perhaps in some intuitive, half-formed way, in the minds of the populations they protect, who know on some level below conscious articulation that the worst things do not always win, that something is pushing back, that the darkness is held in check by something. That knowledge, to the extent it exists at all, is transmitted not through words or symbols or the physical presence of an army, but through the simple continued existence of a civilization that should, by any reasonable extrapolation of the threats arrayed against it, have long since collapsed. The Grey Knights are, in the most fundamental sense, an argument about the nature of duty, about what it means to serve something so completely that the service itself becomes the entirety of your identity, that the question of what you personally get out of it, the recognition, the glory, the ordinary human satisfaction of being seen and acknowledged for what you have done, becomes genuinely irrelevant rather than simply suppressed. The training process ensures this in its thorough way. The removal of prior memories, the replacement of prior names, the 666 rituals that grind away everything that is not the warrior until the warrior is what remains. This is all designed to produce individuals for whom the serving is the being. There is no Kaldor Drygo, the person who also happens to be a Grey Knight, the warrior. There is only Kaldor Drygo, the Grey Knight. The two are identical. This is remarkable. It is also, depending on your values, somewhat disturbing. The line between a warrior of absolute dedicated purity and a soldier who has been so thoroughly conditioned that the question of whether they retain meaningful individual identity is unclear. That line is not always easy to locate in the Grey Knight's story. The chapter does not encourage this analysis. It would probably argue that the question is based on a misunderstanding of what identity means for a being like a Grey Knight, that the aegis and the gene seed and the training and the wards create a self that is not less than an ordinary human self, but differently constituted, shaped by a different set of formative experiences and values. And there is probably truth in that argument. But the Grey Knights also carry within them, in the moments the lore shows us, something that is unmistakably and recognizably human. The grief that some of them feel for the lost humanity in themselves. The attachment that warriors like Arvan Stern form to the people they fight alongside, even knowing those attachments will need to be managed carefully. The weight of what Castellan Crowe carries, the constant psychic warfare with the thing in his sword, is not something a purely mechanical being would experience as meaningful in the way Crowe clearly experiences it. These are people, tremendously altered, tremendously shaped by their purpose, but people. The capacity for what the lore shows us is real attachment and real sacrifice did not disappear in the making of them. And they fight for a humanity that will never fully know they are there. This is the part that does not resolve neatly. The Grey Knights protect people who are kept ignorant of what they are being protected from, sometimes at tremendous cost to those people's dignity and freedom, specifically so that the protection can continue without being undermined by the very awareness of the threat. It is paternalistic in a way that the Imperium at large is paternalistic, a civilization that often treats its citizens as assets to be managed rather than people to be served. But in the Grey Knights' case, the paternalism is grounded in a genuine understanding of what the alternative looks like, of what happens when the warp's influence spreads without containment. And the stakes of getting the calculation wrong are so catastrophic that the argument for maintaining it, even at the cost of individual dignity, is not simply self-serving institutional logic. What has endured for 10,000 years, alongside the battles and the secrecy and the terrible cost of the work, is the chapter itself. The 8 founding Grand Masters set something in motion on Titan at the end of the Horus Heresy that has not stopped. New recruits have joined and been made into Grey Knights and gone out to fight and sometimes died in the process, and other recruits have joined to replace them, and the chapter has bent but not broken. Through every crisis, the 41st and now 42nd millennium has thrown at it. The Great Rift has stretched them. The return of the Daemon Primarchs has cost them dearly. The loss of warriors like Morvans, the captured Epimetheus, the 60 Grey Knights who died at Armageddon in a single engagement, these are genuine wounds in an organization that cannot afford them, and that sustains them anyway, because there is no option that does not involve sustaining them. And somewhere in orbit around Saturn, the citadel of Titan sits carved from black basalt, its wards shimmering in the electromagnetic spectrum in ways that don't quite resolve into anything comprehensible, its banners hanging in halls where only the chapter's own warriors will ever read the names they commemorate. In the crypt below, the remains of 10,000 years of service lie in cold sarcophagi, their specific deeds mostly lost, their sacrifice encoded only in the fact that the chapter persists. In the Librarium Demonica above, the forbidden knowledge continues to be accumulated, maintained, and used by people with the resilience to handle it. In the Augurium, at the top of the tallest tower, the prognosticars look forward along the branching paths of what is coming, and what they see is presumably not comfortable. But the chapter exists, the chapter fights, and because the chapter fights, somewhere in the Imperium tonight, on some world whose name neither you nor I will ever know, something that came through the warp and should not be here is being pushed back, sent screaming into the dark, banished, denied. The membrane between the material universe and the place where the worst things live holds for another moment, for another day. Because silver armor is moving through the smoke and the fire, and the things wearing it refuse absolutely and completely to be anything other than what they are. Think about what that actually means. Lived out across 10,000 years. 10,000 years of waking up, of preparing, of going to the worst places in the galaxy where the worst things have gathered, and doing the work. 10,000 years without public recognition, without the ordinary human rewards that warriors in almost every culture and every era have been motivated by. The promise that if you fight well and live, people will know your name and speak it with respect. The Grey Knights received none of that, and they were designed specifically not to need it, and what they were given in exchange for what was taken from them is not nothing. The clarity of absolute purpose. The company of the finest warriors alive. The knowledge, held quietly and without any need for external validation, that the work matters, that when you push the thing back and seal the tear and the world continues, that is real. That happened. Even if no one will ever write it down. There is a tradition within the chapter, mentioned briefly in some of the more accessible sources, that Grey Knights carry the names of their fallen brothers inscribed on the underside of their vambraces, inside the armor, where no one else will see, not on the outside. not on banners where they might be misread or understood by those without the context to recognize them. On the inside, private, between the warrior and the memory. This is not a chapter that expresses grief publicly. It is a chapter that carries its dead quietly, holding them in the specific way that people hold things they have decided not to put down, regardless of the weight. What the Grey Knights represent, in the end, in the very deepest sense of what they are, within the broader story that Warhammer 40,000 tells, about a civilization trying to survive against impossible odds, is the argument that there are things worth protecting, even if protecting them costs everything. Not in the abstract, not as a principle to be discussed in comfortable surroundings by people who will never have to personally pay the price of the principle's application, but concretely and continuously, in blood and years, and the systematic sacrifice of everything that makes ordinary life livable. The Grey Knights have made this argument with their existence for 10,000 years, and the argument is still standing. That is not nothing. In a setting that is, almost by definition, a meditation on the fragility and the stubbornness of what is worth preserving, the Grey Knights are the specific point at which stubbornness refuses to bend regardless of what the cost is. There is no comfortable version of this. The cost is real. The people who pay it are real. And the thing they are paying for, the continued existence of a civilization that is deeply flawed and often wrong and sometimes monstrous in its own right, but that contains within its trillion-world vastness enough of what the word human is supposed to mean to make the defense of it something other than simply institutional self-preservation, is also real. Complicated and imperfect and often wrong, and never fully capable of understanding what has been spent in its defense, but real and worth the effort, at least in the specific moral universe of the 41st millennium, where the alternative is something that cannot be bargained with and will not stop. The chapter that does not exist, fighting the war that did not happen, to protect a civilization that will never fully understand what they owe to people it will never officially acknowledge. This is the Grey Knights, and now you know. If you have made it all the way to the end of this journey, through one of the most extraordinary and quietly haunting corners of the 41st millennium, thank you, genuinely. This is not a short story, and the fact that you are still here means you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. There is so much more to explore in this universe, so many more stories that sit in the spaces between the official histories, so many more moments of genuine humanity hiding inside the grimness of a setting that sometimes seems designed to make you forget that humanity is in there at all. If you have not already subscribed, please do that now. Hit the notification bell so these stories find their way to you. Leave a comment telling me what you thought, whether you came in already knowing the Grey Knights and found something new here, or whether this was your first real deep dive into who they are. Tell me what you want to hear about next. This galaxy has no shortage of stories worth telling slowly, and every comment you leave helps guide where we go. Rest easy. And remember that somewhere out in the dark, something silver and bright is keeping the worst things from getting through. For the Emperor, always.